For years, Venezuela was in free fall.
Just to give you an idea of how inept the Maduro government was, despite the fact that 2/3 of the economy had evaporated, there was not an economist in the entire cabinet.
2/3 of its economy gone. 8 million people fled the country. Under Nicolás Maduro, the government had become deeply entangled in narcotics trafficking, money laundering, illegal gold mining. The Trump administration tried once before to force him out. In 2019, they backed an opposition leader, hoped the military would flip sides. It didn't work.
And I think his lesson and takeaway that there was sort of go for something quick and easy, or quicker and easier than a wholesale removal of a government, and expect the military to flip and change sides and embrace a U.S.-backed so-called interim president.
Then, last December, the White House released a new national security strategy. It declared the Western Hemisphere a zone of American primacy. On January 3rd, the U.S. forces captured Maduro by targeted extraction. But removing Maduro didn't remove his government. His vice president is now in charge. The same generals, the same party apparatus, remain in place. Washington is now managing Venezuela's oil revenues from a bank in Qatar, deciding where the money goes, auditing how it's spent.
It is in a semi-protectorate status, if you will. Under the U.S., they're going to do everything they can to make sure that these funds are not going to fund illicit activities or corruption. I can't see this being a relationship that will last for very long.
So what happens next? Can this lead to a real democratic transition? Or has the U.S. simply inherited a crisis?
Self-preservation. This is what this government's all about. Stabilization, investment in growth, and then transition to democracy. I don't know how we get to 3 yet.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, U.S. action in Venezuela, assessing strategic implications. Joining us today is Dr. Christopher Sabatini, Senior Fellow for Latin America at Chatham House and founder of Global Americas. Moderating the conversation is Courtney Doggart, President of Network 2020.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Network 2020's discussion about the U.S. capture of Maduro and its implications for Venezuela and Latin America. I realize that it is hard to believe that just a few weeks ago, this capture was the news of the moment, as it has pretty quickly been surpassed by other events, both domestic and international. But that said, as Ishan Tharoor wrote in his Worldview column for the Washington Post last week about the January 3rd raid, he wrote that the move was a geopolitical bombshell, the most concrete expression of Trump's desire for hemispheric domination, and it sent ripple effects as far as Greenland and Iran. So we are very lucky to be exploring a few of those ripple effects today with Dr. Chris Sabatini. Welcome back to Network 2020, Chris. It's great to see you. What I'd like to do is just start with kind of the twin things of the capture of Maduro, as well as the recently released national security strategy at the end of last year, which really signaled, I think many people were all of a sudden surprised by the fact that the U.S. is now very centered on the Western Hemisphere. And all of a sudden, Latin America, which has always been kind of treated off to the side in terms of geopolitics, really took center stage. So I'd love for you to just kind of start us off with how you assess the U.S. role at this stage and what you think Washington believes it is trying to achieve.
So the first part is easier to answer than the second. So first of all, let's be honest, the Trump administration did what it said it was going to do in the national security strategy. It basically said there's a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which basically asserted the U.S.'s right to thwart any foreign influence in the Western Hemisphere in the name of protecting democracy and freedom. And we can scoff at the democracy and freedom part, but the truth is they, at the time, they were all, mostly Latin American, Spanish American, and the U.S. were independent, newly independent former colonies. So there's a sense of solidarity there, but there's also a sense of national security and desire not to let the old world, and they were looking particularly at Great Britain, Spain, and Russia at the time, asserting their influence. But the question of sort of what are the implications? I mean, first of all, for the United States, it's funny because in Donald Trump's first term in 2019, he tried to force the removal of Nicolás Maduro by supporting a shadow government, led by Juan Guaido. In fact, I probably even spoke about this at one of the 2020 events. That failed. And I think his lesson and takeaway that there was sort of go for something quick and easy, or quicker and easier than a wholesale removal of a government, and expect the military to flip and change sides and embrace a U.S.-backed so-called interim president. And so he was looking for something much easier. This is also being driven by immigration. If you remember, in 2024, Donald Trump spoke in the debates with then candidate Joe Biden about the Tren de Aragua of Venezuela had supposedly overtaken a city in Colorado. That wasn't true. He also claimed that Maduro was opening up his prisons and mental institutions to flood the United States with security. That also wasn't true, although there are 8 million immigrants who have left Venezuela, mostly to escape repression, but also economic collapse, in which 2/3 of GDP evaporated in Venezuela. So Donald Trump had many things to do here, but primarily as the military was built up over the course of the 6 months, he began to realize that simply embracing an opposition, which is now unified, and imposing them on a government apparatus that would be Nicolás Maduro, was going to be very costly and chaotic. And indeed, they were right there. He then opted, and in part also, I will say, is for a long time, the opposition has claimed the military is going to flip any minute. There's always this eminent idea of regime change. That didn't happen in the long 5 to 6 month buildup of military forces. And so it came to the point on January 3rd that Trump had to do something. It was limited. It removed Maduro. We can talk about the legality of it internationally, but most Venezuelans support it. In fact, most Latin Americans support it as well. The truth is, Nicolás Maduro, whatever we may think about how Trump got here and the actual sort of process of removing Maduro, the truth is Venezuela had become really I wouldn't say narco state. It had become a deeply corrupt regime embedded in all forms of illicit activity, from illegal gold mining, transshipment point for cocaine, human trafficking, money laundering. So I think basically at the end of the day, Trump was left with a very minimalist option, and it was palatable to him because it basically meant that he wasn't engaging, or at least not for now, in forever wars, the sort he criticized in 2016. And it does show that the capacity of the U.S. military to inflict these things. So we can talk about the geopolitical implications of this and ripple effects, but one of them is going to be that this was truly a shock and awe moment. Even in the buildup, we knew that Nicolás Maduro was changing residences, that he had a coterie of guards that were following him around. And the U.S. did this without wasting U.S. life, without any permanent damage to U.S. equipment, is dramatic. The problem is now that he continue this momentum by leaving basically the Maduro apparatus in power. As you all know, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez is now the president. I can talk a little bit about her. I know her. I know people who work with her. But of course, the truth is this was only a decapitation of the regime, not regime change. And all those things being true about the illicit nature of the regime, it's authoritarian, even quite frankly, totalitarian. And I can talk about many of the very insanely cruel tactics they have used to repress and silence the opposition. But, is this going to get Trump where he wants to go? And is this a model for Trump in the future? And I'll end on this point, Courtney, because you sort of said this I think for Trump, this was a win. I would actually argue that the rhetoric over Greenland before the Davos meeting last week was in part fueled by his sense of success in Venezuela. That you can engage in these kinetic activities and, for the short term at least, be cost-free and have a sort of shock and awe moment globally. He achieved that. I'm not sure it's sustainable. I hope it is for the sake of Venezuelans and that it leads to a democracy, but there are a lot of pending questions here.
Great. Thank you for setting that scene. So you mentioned how basically with the removal of Maduro, it was basically a decapitation, keeping the old regime in place. So what I'd like to dig into now is a little bit about what has shifted and who inside Venezuela really stands to benefit the most from Maduro's removal. And that's just sort of related to that. How have some of the different political, military, economic actors been positioning themselves in this new moment?
Thank you. So today, in fact, probably as we speak, Secretary of State Marco Rubio is testifying before the Senate on exactly this issue. And there are a number of issues, and not coincidentally, actually, very symbolically, after his testimony in the Senate, he's meeting with Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel Prize laureate, who is the opposition leader, who led basically her party to victory in the 2024 stolen elections. But here's the issue, is Delcy Rodriguez, of the sort of the circle around Maduro, is known as being more of a technocrat, as being more pragmatic. She's been the go-to person for negotiating with oil companies. Chevron speaks very highly of her. A number of the hedge funds who own the $160 billion, that includes interest, of Venezuela's defaulted debt. She's been talking to them. She has a much more international profile, a much more professional profile. Just to give you an idea of how inept the Maduro government was, despite the fact that 2/3 of the economy had evaporated. There was not an economist in the entire cabinet. In fact, if you are an economist and you speak about the data that cast a bad light on the government, which is impossible to do because this government was a disaster economically, you could actually end up in jail. So she was the closest thing to a technocrat, she and her team. So I think Donald Trump thought this was a person we can deal with. And I'm sure a lot of the people he's been talking to, both hedge funds as well as oil companies, said this is a person you can talk to. But we have to understand, she is a remnant of the old regime. And quite frankly, it's a very diverse, fractious government. You have Delcy Rodriguez, who's sort of the civilian face, but then you also have two other very important figures who are armed military figures. One is Diosdado Cabello, who's the interior minister, who's really in many ways sort of in charge of a lot of the narcotics. He's also under indictment. There's I believe it's $25 million bounty on his head as well. So if any of you know a way to get him, you can make a quick $25 million and get him on a plane, bring him to Brooklyn. Not for the delicious artisanal cuisine and farmers markets in Brooklyn, but to end up in a prison in Brooklyn. The second is Padrino Lopez, who's the defense minister. And these guys control their own security apparatus. They are the ones who have basically sold out the government or parts of the government to the Colombian guerrilla group, the ELN. They're the ones that have formed these paramilitary groups, colectivos, which are really just gangs who extort, but they're guns for hire, as well as the military. Venezuela, just anecdotally, has the highest number of per capita generals per population of anywhere in the world. And the reason is they just promoted the heck out of them to give them these very cushy and oftentimes lucrative jobs. They control them. And so Delcy has to walk now a very fine line. Donald Trump has referred to her as someone he can deal with. He has a very large stake in making sure that she at least tries to guide or steward the country, at least to avoid chaos and disruption. But by the same token, she cannot look like she is a puppet of Donald Trump or the U.S. CIA. And Donald Trump has not helped her in that case in particular. But also we have to understand that for many people within her circle, and again, in fact, the vast majority of Venezuelans are in favor of Nicolás Maduro having been forced out of the country and seeking trial and justice. The truth is that within her own circle, this is seen, and even within leftist circles generally in Latin America, this was seen as a kidnapping, an illegal operation. So she has to continue to echo that rhetoric. She also has to demonstrate a certain amount of resistance to the United States, rhetorically and maybe even practically. By the same token, is accomplishing many of these things. And here's the issue: by also probably at least hoping to juice the economy sufficiently so that this government can gain enough popularity so that if there's election, they can be returned to office, or just postponing that transition to elections to democracy that Marco Rubio described as the third stage of the third three-stage process: stabilization, investment and growth, and then transition to democracy. I don't know how we get to three yet. We're only at one, and there's also been no deadlines imposed, no benchmarks, how we do that. And even in his testimony, which I listened to a little bit before this, he's not articulating that. He's still defending the past, which is fine, but we need a plan.
Well, speaking of plans, you talked about juicing the economy, and I'd like to just talk about the economy for a little bit, because the long economic collapse is really, I think, a critical backdrop to a lot of what's happened in the country. So how do you think the country's economic trajectory might change or not with the leadership shift? And are there any constraints that you see the new governing arrangement facing as they try to figure out how to really juice the economy, as you say?
So first of all, and let's look at this at two levels, internally and externally. First of all, externally, the U.S. is demanding that the 1,000 or so, 2,000 allegedly, Cuban representatives, Cuban security agents and the like leave the country. Supposedly, many of them have left. Also urging that the Russians leave the country. There's no large contingent of Russians, quite frankly. And also trying to squeeze the Chinese out of the country, but also to squeeze a lot of the concessionary contracts they had for oil and even loans so that they don't benefit from the oil that's being pumped now under U.S. tutelage themselves, as well as the Iranians. The Iranians haven't really been a huge presence, not as much often as described, but they have been there. They've helped Venezuela keep up its oil production. Delcy has been instrumental in that as well. In fact, a lot of the recovery of Venezuela oil production was under her stewardship. So the Iranians need to go. But also now what we need to see is a much more transactional relationship even with oil companies and the like. Now, the U.S. is not allowing non-U.S. oil companies in right now. Primarily it's Chevron and a handful of other smaller companies that are active. But it really is trying to open up the economy and try to generate revenue that will be kept in a bank in Qatar and then allocated to the Venezuelan government, audited by the U.S., where the U.S. specifically designates where that money should go. So sanitation, healthcare, education, what have you, paying the bills as well as paying for staff and salary, and making sure it doesn't fall into illicit means. But by the same token, this may have a very short shelf life. What they're doing right now is they're selling the $500 million worth of oil they've seized in the blockade off the coast of Venezuela. But at a certain point, Venezuelans, I fear, will become very tired of this, saying, okay, but why? Who are you to take our oil, tell us how to spend it, and then make us account for it, which is they will be paying for the audit of their own oil. I can't see this being a relationship that will last for very long. But for now, I think they are still coasting on the tailwinds of having removed Maduro, of a sense of optimism that he's gone, that they've injected liquidity into the economy. We're talking about now the risks of hyperinflation have collapsed. Bolivar is only about 20% overvalued. So there's been some correction in the economy. We're seeing some investment. We're seeing a lot of people coming in, a lot of promise. But then internally, what needs to happen is, quite frankly, they've taken some steps. But again, these are not democratic steps. These are steps to attract investment. The National Assembly just approved a new hydrocarbons law. It's much better than the previous one. It doesn't require that any foreign investment partner with PDVSA, the state oil company, which used to be semi-independent and is now completely co-opted by the government. And it's actually staffed too, not so much with engineers, many of whom left in the early 2000s, but staffed mostly with party hats. So not a real good joint venture partner, quite frankly, in this case. So foreign companies can go in, own their own fields. They've made the royalty rates much more flexible, especially in older investments and in areas where there's heavier crude. They've claimed that they will submit to independent arbitration. It's not clear whether there'll be international arbitration. And quite frankly, under this government, nothing's truly independent, including the Supreme Court, the Electoral Council, the military, what have you. So we don't know really what that means, but she's clearly trying to move this forward. And that is going to actually increase her support among the business class. I'm in touch with a number of Venezuelan business people. Whatever they may think about Nicolás Maduro, they quite frankly are happy that they're seeing some green shoots of economic growth return. So she's doing that. In the meantime, she has to keep Donald Trump sweet. I know there's a tension within the government, the U.S. government right now. Marco Rubio is pushing for some form of democratic transition. And quite frankly, Donald Trump wants to keep this off his desk. He would rather not see any chaos. Again, it was a success. No one wants to mess with the sense of success that he has. And so everyone is going to be scrambling to try to keep this on the rails while also leading towards a democracy, which, quite frankly, Delcy Rodriguez doesn't want.
Right. There, you brought up a lot of interesting things there. I just want to just go back to one point you made. So it sounds like when Donald Trump said he was going to run the country, it feels almost like it's like this stewardship type relationship right now where we're able to say, okay, this is where the money goes. And it's just kind of like a timeline for how long that relationship plays out and how quickly they can get the oil revenues back on track. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that's about right. It is. I mean, we'll see how long it goes on. Right now, Chevron is doubling down. There's this group led by this billionaire Harry Sargent. There are a number of other organizations that are now investigating. We'll see what the financial relationship is. In those cases, quite frankly, a lot of their profits, whether it's in royalties or taxes or whatever, the revenue that they generate that would go to the government, where that will be parked. It is very clear to both, and Marco Rubio just made this very pointed comment in the Senate, that the U.S. is going to, while it is in a semi-protectorate status, if you will, under the U.S., they're going to do everything they can to make sure that these funds are not going to fund illicit activities or corruption. But to your point, there's a number of other things that have to be done that may not necessarily make the scrutiny of the U.S. Let's say reforming the security sector, building institutions, rebuilding infrastructure that's not oil related. There's an electricity crisis right now in Venezuela. You need to incentivize, and no one is really all that excited about investing in electricity. So it'll be interesting to see. Right now, it's the easy part. Fund the salaries, fund some healthcare, put on, if you will, some Band-Aids on the badly hemorrhaging state that is Venezuela. But when it comes to making tough investment decisions, I don't know how that will break down, and I don't know how much agency the Venezuelan government under Delcy will have to do that.
All right, great. I'd like to just kind of shift our attention a little bit wider and pick up a thread you mentioned about, let's say Russia and China in Venezuela and how they need to leave. I'd love to just hear a little bit more about some of those great power politics. How are those countries responding to this shift? How can the U.S. or Venezuela ensure that they are out? And, how does that complicate some of the U.S. involvement and decision-making?
So first of all, an important step in all this is the standing up of the reopening of the U.S. Embassy. That will help. It'll mean that there'll be U.S. public officials on the ground. There will be some intelligence presence on the ground. They'll be able to monitor this. This was not in 2019, the U.S. Embassy under the previous Trump presidency, when he's trying to oust Nicolás Maduro, kicked the U.S. Embassy out. Whatever that meant, the U.S. has really struggled to maintain good information sources and assets within Venezuela. So I think having that will help tremendously. Biden was actually trying to do it as well, but a lot of the people in the current government were very opposed to that. So first of all, I think what's important is this is the dog that didn't bite when it comes to Russia, China, and Iran. A lot of people were saying, Russia will. The truth is, for them, Venezuela was a useful irritant to the United States. Yes, Russia had a number of schemes for money laundering to evade sanctions with Venezuela through cryptocurrency. Iran was also using a lot of the shadow fleets to also then chip, and Russia was as well. But the truth is, these were mostly easy relationships to keep Venezuela afloat. They were not deeply embedded in Venezuela's security structure, its defense strategy, or the like. And indeed, they complained. China and the rest complain. But even China, for example, which has about a $40 billion loan that's being repaid in cut rate oil, even China didn't complain. The truth is, it had already written off a lot of those loans before. So in that sense, Venezuela, while it was truly a sort of landing spot for a lot of these anti-U.S. regimes, there wasn't a tight alliance in that sense. So what do these other countries think? Let's start with the smaller one, Cuba. Cuba is going to be in real dire straits. Cuba was surviving only on about 27 to 34,000 barrels of oil a day that Venezuela was providing, half of which or even more it would sell on the open market to generate hard currency. Cuba was already in the midst of a humanitarian crisis. The evaporation of that oil is going to bring it to its knees. We can talk about whether that means regime change or how. That's a different issue. Russia is very nervous for the following reason. The U.S. is tracking these shadow fleets and justifying its interception of these shadow fleets, these pirate ships. That could quickly be turned on Russia. And I'm not sure Donald Trump would want that. But I can tell you right now, living now in the UK and looking across the English Channel, there are a lot of European governments that would love to see that happen also when it comes to Russian oil and gas that's leaving through shadow fleets and pirate boats. And so now they're considering this. So, when Putin was, expressing his concern over U.S. strategy with Venezuela, he wasn't doing it so much for Venezuela. He was doing it for his own ability to fund his own war. In the case of Iran, look, they're tied up in their own internal turmoil right now and trying to maintain control. I don't think Iran is going to go to the mat on this. And so quite frankly, while Delcy may have some legacy issues of solidarity and loyalty to these governments, the truth is the U.S. is really going to be the only game in town, and it's doing everything it can to ensure that. So in that sense, the collapse or the ending of Nicolás Maduro and the, if you will, sort of the semi-protectorate status that Venezuela is now into is not going to materially affect necessarily many of these countries. Now, people often say that, oh, we just gave a license for Putin to invade other countries other than Ukraine, whether Moldova or Romania or what have you, or we just gave a green light to China to seize Taiwan. And they're basically in this NSS, the National Security Strategy document, this idea, we've recreated this idea of spheres of influence. The truth is, we can talk about the risks of that. We can talk about sort of the potential offensiveness of this and the potential break with international norms. Truth is, let's be honest, Putin and Xi Jinping don't need an excuse to do what they want to do. They've always done it. I mean, Putin invaded Ukraine. He's meddled in elections in Moldova, Romania, and Georgia. He didn't need Donald Trump to do that. So, I mean, I think that's a little bit overblown. I think there's a larger threat to the international order, international law, that we can discuss. And in that case, too, quite frankly, I don't think Donald Trump, again, is entirely to blame. We saw the stolen election in 2024. No one really did in the neighborhood. Brazil didn't do anything. Colombia didn't do anything. There's a need for preemptive diplomacy. It's not just about defending national sovereignty. It's about defending popular sovereignty and self-determination. And self-determination is in the UN Charter, as we all know. So, yes, internationally, I think these governments are looking at this with a little bit of concern. I think what we saw, quite frankly, in the case of Greenland and Europe during Davos and before Davos was a recognition that, oh, crap, Donald Trump is going to do what he says. And I think that, and I think in some ways, more than Venezuela serving as a model for Donald Trump in other countries or other regions, even more so. We can talk about other countries at risk in the hemisphere for this sort of intervention. For a number of that, Europeans recognize that actually you can begin to negotiate with Donald Trump. And it, despite all the fire and brimstone he may be throwing at you, there is a need to stand up. And I think what we're seeing now is not so much the threat of, and there was that moment of the threat of him becoming intoxicated by his success in Venezuela and using that for others. But now we're looking at a sense of actually the Europeans, I wouldn't say intoxicated, sobering up a little bit and realizing, wait, we can start to, the outcomes may not be optimal, but there is a way to do this. And I'll tell you right now, talking to Latin American leaders, they're taking notes.
So I'd love to just get in one more question or two, and then we'll turn to the Q&A box. And if you're listening and you have a question, please feel free to pop it in the Q&A box, and I will get to as many as I can. So the region, right? It's heading into a consequential election cycle. I think there's upcoming elections in Brazil. There's, a lot of questions about which way some countries in Latin America may turn. How does Maduro's capture factor into those political debates? Does it reinforce concerns about authoritarianism? Does it energize anti-interventionist narratives? Like, what are the broader implications you might see across the region? Or maybe there are none. Maybe it just is a case-by-case basis.
So the one thing that's different, and I think people are glossing over when they talk about the Monroe Doctrine, the Trump corollary, is unlike other manifestations of the Monroe Doctrine, there's a very sharply partisan element in the Monroe Doctrine that really, some people will, when I just gave a talk at Oxford, and some people say, well, this is the same thing that the U.S. was doing in the Cold War. It's not, in the sense of, first of all, most of them were not elected governments. And there was a legitimate geostrategic threat in that case. But in this case, Donald Trump, these are largely elected governments, with the exception of Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. And they may be imperfect democracies, but they have elections and their opposition, a range of candidates representing different views on political positions that compete. But what we saw, in Argentina, when Donald Trump offered the $20 billion line of credit, it wasn't a loan, but a line of credit to Javier Milei just before the midterm elections, was an effort to shore up his allies. Javier Milei, it's not just the hair between Javier Milei and Trump. There's a lot of similarities there in terms of their political trajectory, their rhetoric, their bombast. And Trump identifies with that. And Javier Milei has paid his respects to Donald Trump. Similarly, with Daniel Noboa in Ecuador, again, a president confronting a very severe narco-terrorist threat. He's also been a favorite of Donald Trump's. We saw Donald Trump endorse the right-wing candidate in Honduras, who was just sworn in this week, up against two other candidates. That was something that never would have happened, say, in the last couple of years. And certainly, again, even during the Cold War, the personal, presidential, public endorsement of someone I mean, I can't imagine Ronald Reagan ever saying, this is our man, vote for that person. It just didn't happen. We can talk about other ways it may have influenced, but this is very public and very particularly partisan. The same is true in Brazil, where Donald Trump imposed, then removed a 50% tariff on Brazilian goods entering the United States because of the trial against his friend, the self-declared Trump of the tropics, Jair Bolsonaro, for being tried for an insurrection. In this year of elections, to get to your point, Courtney, we had elections in Chile. They turned a right-wing candidate. That was of their own doing, and that had more to do with dynamics over crime and insecurity in Chile. We see Argentina, Javier Milei. We see Paraguay just join the Board of Peace. We see El Salvador, who Trump has openly embraced under Nayib Bukele. They just joined the Board of Peace. And what we're going to see in a lot of these cases, Colombia is coming up and Brazil, is a subtle or not so subtle effort by the Trump administration to try to sway voters. They may not need much swaying in many cases. For many of them, in the case of Colombia, Gustavo Petro is deeply unpopular. Many blame him for the rise in crime and insecurity. What Trump is doing, though, is not just trying to, if you will, sort of bless the process, but endorse a specific candidate that's cut more from his cloth, and with the promises of, in the case of Colombia, continuing security support. So I think a year from now, when we have this meeting, I think we're going to look at a much more Trump-aligned hemisphere, not entirely of his doing, but one that he'll be very happy with and will have done his utmost to try to influence.
Great, thank you. So if you had, let's say, the opportunity to get to the president's inbox or Marco Rubio's inbox, and you can choose which one you think would be more effective, what would you recommend that they do right now? What's sort of the biggest thing that you're watching for to make sure that this heads down a direction where, you have a successful operation and it remains successful for the people of Venezuela and, maybe not for international law, but for, other purposes? What are you looking at?
It's a good question because, as I like to say, look, we can relitigate the 6-month buildup and the blowing up of the boats and the extraction. I'm not an international lawyer. It's not my business. Now the question is, how do we ensure this is successful? There are others who can debate this later. I'm not even a historian, so it's history. I live in the world. I'm very present. But in this particular case, I think what is necessary is, and I know this would be anathema to this, but I would make the case if I had access to Marco Rubio's inbox. We need to get other countries involved. This cannot be only an American land grab, an American-driven. Because we will need the support of the Europeans, some neighbors. Now, there's some we don't necessarily need to trust. As I say, Brazil had its chance and it fumbled. I'll be honest. They hate when I say this. I had an article recently, and boy, they were angry about that. But it's true. So you have to find, and Lula is going to meet, the president of Brazil will be meeting with President Trump. We'll see. But I think right now the first step is to build up a coalition to say, okay, we'll debate the legality of what we did, but we need to work together to ensure that we're on the same page. And that we're sure, because the truth is Europe does have some leverage on this. So that's the first thing. The second is start to articulate a timeline. Right now, we know that Delcy Rodriguez and those around her are trying to bide for time. They're trying to slow walk this as much as they can. We need to have a timeline, and we need to have a set of benchmarks for when that will happen. And that's precisely why we need other countries involved as well. This cannot be only a U.S. Yes, this would violate the national security strategy document. But the truth is, whether it's Belgium, Italy, or Spain, they're not going to represent a threat to U.S. national security interests. They can, however, present a nice united front to be able to help ensure that not just is the government sort of committed to a set of deadlines, but it will meet them. And then when the time comes, monitoring those elections. And the EU has a very good, in fact, the EU monitored the 2021 elections. They were not allowed to monitor the 2024 elections. But you will need non-US election monitors that are credible to be there to monitor all these things and everything else. Security sector reform, judicial reform, you need them. This cannot be left at the discretion of the Trump administration alone.
As a follow-up to that, I mean, I know they had the monitoring the last elections, and that was a point of contention. Is there any, ramifications or lessons learned from, the lack of the lack of effective pushback, let's say, during the last election cycle?
So a little bit of sort of background that I have a Venezuela working group here at Chatham House. and we all watched the elections. And after their theft, we would convene in the hybrid format, EU member countries, Latin American countries. And the truth is no one really knew what to do. So it's a good point. I mean, would they have the leverage to do something? Would they have the, excuse my Spanish, cojones to do something in that case? I don't know. It didn't work in 2024. I think I hate to pick on Brazil, but who was more unforgivable on this was Brazil's decision to keep quiet about it. But you're right. But I do think this is a much more tempered regime. It has to be. I mean, the U.S. is controlling its money. That's a huge point of leverage that didn't exist in 2024. But the point is well taken. We saw in 2024, despite widespread condemnation, even from the United Nations, that this was a stolen election. Their attitude was, we don't care. So you're right. It's self-preservation. This is what this government's all about.
Well, we shall see. Chris, thank you so much. You gave us so much to think about. It was a real pleasure to have you here. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Okay, everyone. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.